She said it without drama, without tears, without even lowering her voice, as if she were stating a fact the universe had already decided. We were sitting in a quiet corner of a small cafe near the old courthouse, the kind of place people chose when they didn't want to be overheard but also didn't want to be alone. The spoon in her hand traced slow circles in her untouched coffee, the sound faint but sharp in the silence between us. "I need a husband by tomorrow," she said, finally lifting her eyes to meet mine. For a second, I thought she was joking, the way people joke when they're exhausted and hoping someone will stop them. I smiled, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. Her expression didn't change. There was fear there, yes, but also resolve, like someone standing at the edge of a cliff who had already decided to jump. Outside the window, cars passed, people laughed, a couple argued over directions, life continuing as if her sentence hadn't just tilted my world. I asked her what she meant, my voice lighter than I felt. And that's when the dam broke. She spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other, about a legal deadline tied to her family estate, about relatives who smiled politely while sharpening knives behind her back, about how marriage was the one condition standing between her and losing the house her parents had left her, the last thing that still felt like home. She wasn't asking for love, she said. She wasn't even asking for romance. She was asking for time, for space to breathe, for a way out of a corner she hadn't chosen. I watched her hands as she talked, noticed how they shook despite her controlled tone, how much effort it took for her not to fall apart right there. Memories surfaced uninvited, of all the small ways she'd been there for me over the years, lending me money she couldn't spare, listening to my failures without judgment, believing in me when I didn't. The sensible thing would have been to tell her no, to explain that this was crazy, reckless, impossible. My mind screamed every warning it could find. But before I could organize them into words, my mouth betrayed me. "Then you'll have to live with me," I said. The sentence hung between us, absurd and irreversible. Her eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in surprise, as if she hadn't expected an answer at all, let alone that one. "Live with you," she repeated, slower this time, testing each word. I nodded, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't fully understand what I was offering, only that it felt wrong to let her face this alone. I explained clumsily, talked about how a marriage on paper would be easier to defend if we actually shared a place, how honesty would be simpler than acting, how I didn't want this to turn into a lie that ate us alive. She listened without interrupting, her gaze searching my face like she was reading a contract written in expressions instead of ink. For a long moment, she said nothing. The cafe noise seemed to grow louder, cups clinking, chairs scraping, someone laughing too hard at a joke. Finally, she exhaled, a long, shaky breath that sounded like relief fighting fear. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted softly. I didn't rush to reassure her. I knew this had to be her choice as much as mine. "You don't have to decide forever," I said. "Just decide for now." She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, clearer somehow. "Okay," she said. "Then let's do it." The word "do it" carried more weight than either of us wanted to acknowledge. We paid and stepped outside, the afternoon sun bright and unforgiving. As we walked, the reality of what we'd agreed to settled in, heavy but strangely steady. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a risk, raw and unpolished. But as she walked beside me, no longer alone with her fear, I realized that sometimes the most life-changing decisions don't arrive with certainty, only with the quiet courage to say yes before tomorrow comes. By the time evening settled in, the sky bruised purple and gold. She stood outside my apartment building with a single suitcase at her feet, as if her entire life had learned how to compress itself into something manageable. The streetlight flickered above us, casting nervous shadows that matched the uncertainty humming between us. I unlocked the door and stepped aside, suddenly aware of how small my place was, how every corner held evidence of who I was and who I wasn't. She hesitated at the threshold, fingers tightening around the handle of her suitcase, then crossed it like someone stepping into unfamiliar territory without a map. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old books. The couch sagged in the middle, the shelves leaned slightly, and the walls were bare except for a few photographs I'd never bothered to replace. She took it all in quietly, her eyes moving slowly, not judging, just absorbing. We stood there for a moment, unsure where to put ourselves, until I gestured toward the couch and she sat, smoothing her coat over her knees like she was trying to maintain some sense of order in a life that had just leapt off course. I sat across from her, leaving a careful distance, the air between us heavy with things unsaid. The absurdity of the situation finally surfaced, and she let out a short, breathless laugh that sounded more like disbelief than humor. "Tomorrow," she said softly, as if saying it out loud might make it less real. We talked then, not about love or futures or anything grand, but about rules, boundaries, the fragile architecture that would keep this arrangement from collapsing under its own weight. Separate rooms, she insisted, at least at first. Complete honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. No using each other as shields or excuses. I agreed to everything, relieved by the clarity, grateful for something solid to hold on to. As the night deepened, the conversation shifted, growing quieter, more personal without either of us intending it to. She told me about her parents, how the house tied to the inheritance still echoed with their voices, how losing it felt like losing them all over again. Her words were steady, but her hands gave her away, twisting together in her lap. I listened, really listened, resisting the urge to fix anything, knowing this was one problem I couldn't solve with advice. When it was my turn, I spoke about my own fears, about feeling like life had somehow started without me, about the pressure of being expected to have answers I didn't have. Admitting it out loud felt like peeling off a layer of armor I'd worn for years. Somewhere between confessions and pauses filled with the hum of the refrigerator, the tension between us softened. We weren't two people staging a lie anymore. We were two people choosing vulnerability because there was no other way forward. Later, I showed her the spare room, small but clean, the window overlooking the alley where city sounds never quite slept. She placed her suitcase on the bed and stood there, suddenly very still. "Thank you," she said, not meeting my eyes. The words carried more weight than any promise. When I retreated to my own room, the apartment felt different, fuller, charged with a presence that changed its rhythm. Sleep came slowly, my thoughts looping endlessly around what we were about to do, the consequences I hadn't yet imagined. At some point in the night, I heard her door open and close softly, footsteps moving down the hall, then silence. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that tomorrow would redraw the lines of both our lives. This wasn't a rehearsal anymore. It was the night before something irreversible, and despite the fear coiled in my chest, there was also a strange sense of rightness, as if chaos had finally found a place to rest. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale light slipping through the curtains as if it had no idea how much was at stake. I lay awake long before the alarm, listening to the unfamiliar quiet of the apartment, aware of another presence moving carefully through the same space. The smell of coffee drifted down the hall, grounding and ordinary, and when I stepped into the kitchen, she was already there, dressed simply, hair pulled back, her expression focused in a way that told me she'd been awake just as long. We exchanged a small, tentative smile, the kind people share before stepping onto uncertain ground. Words felt unnecessary, so we moved around each other in a careful rhythm, brushing past without touching, both of us aware that today would redefine everything. The walk to the courthouse was quiet, the city waking up around us, vendors setting up stalls, buses signed to a stop, life continuing with cruel indifference. With each step, the reality pressed harder against my chest, not fear exactly, but the weight of responsibility. Inside, the building smelled of paper and disinfectant, the echo of footsteps bouncing off high ceilings. The clerk slid forms across the counter without looking up, her practiced efficiency making the moment feel strangely small. We filled in names and dates, our hands occasionally bumping, each accidental contact sending a jolt through me. When it was time to stand side by side, I felt the heat of her arm next to mine, the steady rise and fall of her breath. Her voice wavered for half a second as she spoke, then found its strength, clear and unwavering. When my turn came, I was surprised by how easily the words left my mouth, how little they felt like a lie. In that moment, it wasn't about deceiving anyone. It was about choosing to stand with someone who needed me. When it was over, she laughed, a sharp, breathless sound that carried relief, disbelief, and something else I couldn't quite name. Outside, She squeezed my hand without thinking, then seemed startled by the gesture, but didn't let go right away. "We did it," she said, as if saying it aloud might make it real. The afternoon unfolded like a performance we hadn't rehearsed enough for. Her relatives arrived with polite smiles and probing questions, their eyes assessing me like an object they hadn't yet decided to trust. I answered as best I could, keeping my tone calm, my stories consistent, feeling like I was walking a tightrope without a net. She played her part flawlessly, shoulders back, voice steady, though I could feel the tension radiating from her whenever they leaned too close. When it was finally over and the door closed behind them, she slumped against the wall, exhaustion written into every line of her body. I didn't think, didn't ask, just stepped forward and held her as she slid down to sit on the floor. For a long moment, we stayed there, the silence thick but comforting, the weight of the day settling into something manageable. "I don't know how I would have done this without you," she murmured, her voice muffled against my shoulder. I didn't reply, afraid that if I spoke I might say too much or too little. That evening, we ordered takeout and ate on the couch, the television flickering uselessly in the background. We talked about small things, trivial things, as if easing ourselves back into normal life. But underneath it all was an awareness that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just an agreement anymore. It was a shared experience, a line crossed together. As night fell, she looked at me thoughtfully, her gaze lingering a second longer than before. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time. I nodded, understanding that gratitude wasn't the whole story. Whatever this was becoming, it had already changed us, and there was no going back to who we were yesterday. The days that followed did not announce themselves as extraordinary, yet everything felt different, as if the air inside the apartment had learned a new language. Mornings began with quiet routines, shared without discussion, 2 cups of coffee placed on the counter, the newspaper folded and left between us like an invitation rather than a barrier. At first, we moved carefully, respecting the rules we had created: separate rooms, measured conversations, deliberate distance. But living together has a way of eroding formality. I learned the sound of her footsteps, the pause she took before speaking when something mattered, the way she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening. She learned my silences, how I retreated inward when overwhelmed, how I left cabinet doors open without realizing it. We argued about small things, dishes left in the sink, lights left on, the thermostat never quite where either of us wanted it. Those arguments never lasted long, dissolving into uneasy laughter or quiet apologies, because beneath them was the knowledge that we had both chosen this, imperfect and unplanned. One night, as rain drummed steadily against the windows, she sat on the edge of the couch and admitted she was afraid the truth would eventually surface, that the marriage born of necessity would one day demand more than either of us could give. I listened, understanding that fear all too well, and told her that whatever happened, we would face it honestly. That promise, simple as it was, seemed to settle something between us. Slowly, without any dramatic turning point, the space we shared began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. We cooked meals together, made plans for weekends, shared stories we had never thought to tell anyone. The line between obligation and choice blurred until it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. One evening, sitting on the floor surrounded by half-finished dreams and empty takeout containers, she looked at me with an expression that was softer, braver than before. She asked if I ever regretted answering her in that cafe. I thought of the life I might have lived if I had said no. Quieter, safer, lonelier. "No," I said, meeting her gaze. "I don't regret choosing you." The words surprised me with their truth. She didn't respond right away, but the way her eyes shone told me I had reached something real. We didn't rush into declarations or promises. Instead, we let trust grow in the quiet moments, in shared laughter, in the comfort of knowing someone would be there at the end of the day. The marriage that had begun as a shield slowly became a bridge, connecting two people who had been standing on opposite sides of fear. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, she reached for my hand without hesitation. A simple gesture that carried more meaning than any vow spoken under fluorescent courthouse lights. In that moment, I understood that love does not always arrive wrapped in certainty or grand romance. Sometimes it begins with a desperate sentence, a risky answer, and the courage to live with the consequences. What started as a solution to survive tomorrow had become a reason to believe in all the days after, and as we stood there together, ordinary and extraordinary all at once, I knew that this story, born from urgency, had quietly turned into a life we were choosing, not because we had to, but because we wanted to.